To start off the dedicated Sorceress segments of the skill guide, we're going to start with a set of skills that had a bunch of drama in the months leading up to 2.4, mostly with people crying foul about a nerf of sorts that was actually just a return to standard behavior to prevent a skill from being overpowered. This is the damage over time branch of the fire tree, with Firewall, Blaze, and Meteor being the big trifecta of the pile, which you usually end up choosing just one to focus on as your fire damage source, since while they are overlapping utility, they have different synergies and point requirements, not to mention you have to wonder how many sources of fire you really need at one time. Starting with the lowest damage and most support-oriented of the three, we have Blaze, which got an overall buff in 2.4 and was made even cheaper to invest in to boot due to an increase in base damage, but removal of the Firewall synergy. Though the big boost wasn't just the damage and point shift, but rather the addition of a faster run walk boost, making it useful in a number of circumstances and also buffing Inferno Stride a bit for off-class use. Generally, the uses for this skill are strictly for support purposes, by providing consistent damage while kiting enemies, serving as a secondary damage source for certain builds, and generally being just a solid option for field control, and since it uses auto-spawn on movement rather than a number of missiles per second, you can stack them up even more with new perks by constantly being moving at your new higher speed. The only other use for this, at least in Lord of Destruction since I have not tested it in Resurrected, is messing with spawn mechanics at an exceptionally high level of the skill, though this is a bit fiddly at best in optimal conditions, so your average player will never run into it. And while there is also a bit of an oddity with skills like Leap, Charge, Whirlwind, etc., it's best to just understand that it works while running or walking, not while doing other weird movement techs. Moving on to the big brother though, we have Firewall, which is exactly what it sounds like, a giant wall of fire you summon in front of you that spawns up much in the same way as say the Necromancer's Bone Wall, but instead of being a solid object, this gives you a wall of damage that obstructs nothing. A bug was patched that took the skill from being the flavor of the month and Resurrected to returning it back to its classic use of being a budget fire damage option on dual elemental builds. Namely, the way Firewall stacks was fixed back to how it behaved in older versions of the game to prevent super stacks from being a thing really. As far as raw damage per second, the skill will sit at about double that of Blaze when similarly invested in, but comes with the downside of being a stationary tool, which while great for stationary enemies, means you need to plan your placement a bit whenever you pull it out against enemies that are mobile, or things like melee attackers or enemies with scripts that cause them to reposition frequently. The general strategy is to either park the Firewall near your mercenary to kill the enemies harassing them, or to drop a Firewall down and run along it, to lead enemies across it for as long as possible. Firewalls are of course more effective against larger opponents due to them touching more of the damage points at once, which makes it still a fairly handy use case against act bosses, despite no longer being able to decimate them on players 8 in less time than any other class. The last skill is one that people generally have a love-hate relationship with, and I'm no exception. Namely, I love this skill on keyboard and mouse, but absolutely bloody hate it on controller. This is because, much like Blizzard and Firewall, it is very much an aim and timing dependent skill, and there are a few misunderstandings about how Meteor distributes damage as well. Mainly, it's best to look at it as two parts: the impact, which deals a straight splash fire damage in the area of landing, and is extremely straightforward, and then the burn pattern, which is not the same shape as the explosion, but rather is comprised of very specific scatterings of what essentially amounts to miniature stationary Firewall missiles. Simply put, it is possible for enemies to be in the middle of the impact crater and only take damage from the impact, but not the resulting fires, if they're positioned just right at least. Or they can take exceptional damage from the fires if they're big enough and positioned just wrong for them. The big reason most people are really hit or miss on this skill is because it's a fire and wait skill, requiring you to anticipate enemy movement more than even skills like earlier mentioned Firewall, since you want the target to not only get to the burn, but more important, you want them to get the impact damage as well, which requires them to be in a specific spot at a specific time. The most common strategy for this is just to cast Meteor on your mercenary while they tank, though the more advanced strategies, or heck, situations where you don't have good mercenary equipment to keep them alive, learning to drop and run to hit enemies is a useful skill, which generally means aiming near your own feet, then leading the enemy into the spot by running away, rinse, and repeat. Especially on crowds, it's super effective. So, when you play fire builds, do you prefer these damage over time effects, or do you prefer to smash enemies in the face with reckless abandon with skills like Fireball and Firebolt? Mention it down below, and as always, a special thanks to the channel members, patrons, and subscribers that make this content possible.